varying nature.
Right now, wars are being fought over oil. In a short matter of time, they will be fought over water.
An upheaval, a massive change is required.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final episode of the Georgia Enviro Show. I'm your Enviro host, Cody Norrid, the Interim Executive Director at Georgia Interfaith Power Light. The Georgia Enviro Show is a 6-part live stream series which has been aiming to start conversations and highlight environmental and climate issues in Georgia. The Georgia Enviro Show was conceived of and produced by the Dogwood Alliance and several partner organizations, including Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. GIPL is a faith-based environmental organization that has worked across the state of Georgia for over 16 years, helping to inspire and equip people of faith for faithful environmental action. As a religious response to climate change, resource depletion, and environmental justice issues, GIPL offers environmental education opportunities similar to this, as well as green team coaching, practical pathways for congregations and faith communities to downsize their carbon footprint of their facilities through energy efficiency programs, water efficiency, and clean energy alternatives. We also provide opportunities for people to get engaged in policy opportunities to protect the natural resources of Georgia, including our forests, our coast, and care of our neighbor. We fight policies that perpetuate environmental injustices, such as coal ash that was featured on the show last week, and the increasing energy burden across the Southeast and in this state. Tonight, we will have 2 guests on the show, Dr. Jennifer Ayers and Reverend Michael Malcolm. Both will talk from their own perspectives about the importance of theological justifications for creation care and environmental activism. After they speak, we'll have some open time for Q&A, and I hope that you will ask your questions in the comment boxes, and I will try to get to them if we have time. So first off, we will hear from Dr. Jennifer Ayers, the Associate Professor of Religious Education and the Director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Dr. Ayers has been a friend to GIPL for years and continues to offer her classes to congregations in GIPL's network on such topics as food justice, religious environmental education, and environmental practical theology. Tonight, she's going to talk about some of the theological groundings for creation care, the importance of some place-based religious environmental education, as well as some other work on the environment and vulnerability. So Dr. Ayers, take it away.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you for the invitation to be in this conversation with you and with all those who are out there watching us. I want to tell you briefly that I teach at Candler School of Theology, and my entrance into environmental justice work and eco-theology actually came a little bit sideways in that my original work was on social movement activism. And I was working on a book that was specifically focused on religious engagement in the food justice movement. And I was primarily, when I first started that work, thinking about issues like food access and nutrition and wage justice and economic justice. And the environmental questions were important, of course, for understanding the question, but they weren't the primary questions that brought me into that research. However, as I kept going with the work, I started to get really taken with the theological and ecological motivations of so many people who were engaged in food justice work. And so my most recent book, which is called Inhabitants, tries to build a theology of ecological consciousness. Aldo Leopold once said that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. One lives alone in a world of wounds. In other words, it's actually a lot easier to just not be environmentally or ecologically educated. But of course, we live in a time in which there are many sites of vulnerability for human beings. Just during this pandemic, the public health crises that we're facing, the crises of racial justice and police violence remind us that we do live in a world of wounds. And so my work is actually about trying to invite Christians in particular, that is my religious tradition, to lean into the fragility of human and the more than human life in the world. And one of the things that I try to think about in my work is how to encourage human beings to be full, conscious, loving inhabitants of the planet. And so an inhabitant, of course, is a creature who lives well within the context and bounds of its habitat. The word habitat might bring to mind the dwelling places of non-human creatures, the ecosystems that they affect by their presence and upon which they depend to survive. Human beings are no different, though. We, too, are inhabitants in a habitat. And in scripture and in the sacred text of the world, we encounter a portrait of human beings as inhabitants, creatures in a habitat created, sustained, and loved by God. Although this habitat is a wounded and fragile home for divine love and creative power, human beings find the deep roots of inhabitants in biblical stories of creation and promises of future flourishing. So I think that understanding ourselves as inhabitants thus presents to us our life's work of learning how to become just, loving, and responsible members of a vulnerable and sacred household. It's not, inhabitants though, is not like a singular choice that we make. It's an unfolding way of life. And we're always sort of trying to figure out how to do this better, how to be more just and loving and responsible as we seek to live in the world. It's a sacred calling that is as close to us as our own homes and our own families. I like to say that home is where we learn to be our fullest selves and where we live into our deepest and most mundane responsibilities. It's where we share life together. It's where we celebrate, where we are nourished, where we grieve, and where we build futures together. We also must do something far scarier, and that is because home is where we love in the most vulnerable and unguarded way that humans know how to love. In some homes, it's precisely this vulnerability and unguardedness that makes possible deep wounding and harm, broken relationships, and experiences of alienation. And so when I talk about being an inhabitant of this ecological household, sorry, that's another inhabitant of my home. It's to think about home in this way is to embrace and to take seriously the ways in which harm can actually be perpetuated at home. So inhabitants thus demands a willingness to love other beings to a degree that real loss is possible. A willingness to courageously encounter the human and ecological suffering of the world and to be fully present to it. It is to open ourselves to the hard and wondrous work of loving and seeking the healing of a beautiful and hurting world. So that's some of the theological roots of vulnerability and inhabitants. It also demands a little bit of attention to how we connect to a particular place, to how to know a place up close and in detail. So, sorry, all the inhabitants in my house are trying to wrangle these dogs. It's related deeply to how we live in a particular place, to know it up close and in detail. And so, as I was saying earlier, home is too often romanticized. The sense of place also is too often romanticized. Quite frankly, it also is often described according to a white, racialized ideal. But attention to place helps us to attend to the wounds and the promise that necessarily come with being ecological beings. It helps us think about how we are located in particular places. It helps us think about how we can be dislocated, whether by forced or chosen migration. And it can also help us think about how we are perpetually being relocated in new places. I think I may just stop there. I have a few examples of communities. In my work, I try to look at particular communities who are trying to live into this work of inhabitants, communities, religious communities in rural and urban settings, small and large religious communities, communities for whom economic factors have sort of brought up the ecological questions, and communities for whom local ecological crises have brought up ecological questions. But all of it, I think, are the multiple instances of how it is that we live as loving inhabitants of a place. So, and I know that Cody has done some work on place and the variety of ways in which people relate to their ecological places. So I'll just turn it back over to you, Cody.
Yeah, thank you. I always love to hear you talk about this, and I think that it reminds me, the work on inhabitants requiring vulnerability, I think, is really important, and that it also requires us to be honest and pay attention to what we see, because I think so often when we talk about the environment, we either talk about the beauty that's super far away, it's the Rockies or an island somewhere that we're like really, really beautiful and pristine. So then we disassociate from the environment that's around us and the sort of beauty and the mundane or the things that we're familiar with. And we also do the same thing with environmental problems. So we talk about kind of trash pits in a foreign country, or we talk about plastic circling around in the ocean, but then we also ignore kind of the issues right in our own community that we could do something about.
Yeah. If I can just say one more thing in relationship to that. This year, we lost ecofeminist theologian Sally McFaig, who in her work has said that one cannot love the whole world if one has not learned how to love a particular piece of the world. And loving means seeing it in full and naming the harm and the hurt and the wound that is close to us.
Yeah, I think if we're really going to talk about how it is that we cultivate a sense of love and care for the environment, it has to be about the place in which we sit, the communities in which we sit. For our case, Georgia, it's natural resources, it's forests, it's rivers, it's oceans, it's people. And I think that is a perfect transition to who our next guest is going to be for tonight. And we'll get back to some of your examples and thoughts when we bring everybody back together. But I'll transition us to our next guest, who is a good friend of mine and colleague, Reverend Michael Malcolm. He's the executive director of the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power Light. He also serves as the environmental justice representative for the UCC, the United Church of Christ. Michael's been a friend with Gipple for quite some time, working as a pastor here in Georgia, and then moving on to start Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael's going to talk about his perspective on why this work is important theologically, but is also going to lay a bit of the foundation for environmental justice. As Dr. Ayers said, we have to pay attention to the places and communities in which we sit and what is happening, both the beauty and also the harm. And we have an obligation to get involved in those things. And so I know in particular that's been going on in the Stonecrest community here in Georgia just last week and this week. And so, Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Cody. As you were talking and you were getting ready to introduce me and you were rattling off all that stuff, I wanted to really be your hype man and like, yeah, and say it like, yeah. So, but appreciate you, man. Listen, I don't have a whole lot of time to present, but I really want to present what I have for you. I must speak out of my Christian context today. I'm in a mood, and so when I'm in that mood, I got to allow for the Christian preacher to me to stand up and speak out. In Scripture, the Bible says that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And when I look at that particular scripture, I see environmental justice come to mind, because that is exactly what environmental justice is. Environmental justice is loving our neighbor. But then there were, as we have today, some critics in the crowd. And one of them asked Jesus, they said, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus began to give context to what he meant by who the neighbor was. And one of the examples that he uses is that of a neighbor that comes knocking at midnight. And some of you may have heard this in the context of Dr. King preaching on this text about knocking at midnight. And the text tells us that there was a neighbor that came and knocked on his neighbor's door, and he knocked in the most inopportune time. And the neighbor shooed him away because his family was sleeping, and he kept on knocking anyway. And eventually the neighbor got up and took care of him. And there were a few things that kind of stood out in that for me. The first thing that I saw was that in order for us to love our neighbor, or the way that we love our neighbor is we love our neighbor simply when they come knocking. In other words, when our neighbor asks, we're supposed to meet the needs of our neighbor. But in order to do that, you've got to recognize your privilege. Understand that you actually have a home that somebody would come and knock at. Understand that you're blessed enough to have enough in your plenty that you can help someone else in their lack. So you recognize, or you recognize that you have privilege. But another thing with loving your neighbor, you love your neighbor even when it's not convenient. As the text tells us, the neighbor came knocking in the most opportune time. The neighbor came knocking when everybody was sleeping. The reality is, as you've seen with COVID, as you've seen with the uprisings, as you've seen with all of the social ills that are happening right now, we have no control over the things that happen in our lives. Sometimes life just happens. And when life happens, it's always good to know that you've got someone you can go to. And one of the things about environmental justice is it takes all of us to be involved in order for it to go away, or in order for it to be diminished, or in order for it to be regulated, in order for it to not hurt as bad. It's going to take all of us to fight this fight. The reality is that we have discriminate pollution. In other words, pollution is planted, and it's planted specifically. If you look at the history of redlining, and when you look at that history of redlining, you'll understand that the same redlining that has been outlawed is still in place. The people still live in the same places, and not only do the people still live in the same places, but their problems live right there too. And sometimes, my brothers and my sisters, it just comes to a point where our problems outweigh some of our other realities. And then we have to go and we have to knock, because if we don't start knocking, if we don't start screaming out help, if we don't start saying Black Lives Matter, then other folk will never know that we're actually in trouble. The reality is all of us live in toxic cities. If we have Black communities, if we have brown communities, if we have indigenous communities, if we have poor communities, there is a toxic city in your city. And whether you live in it or you live around it, it still takes your attention to give it some help, because the reality is, my brothers and my sisters, the wind blows and the water flows. You can plant pollution, but you can't contain it. All of us suffer. So not only do we love our neighbor when they come knocking, not only do we love our neighbor when it's not convenient, but the other thing about environmental justice and loving your neighbor is you love your neighbor simply when they have needs. I am often, when I'm in places where I'm the lesser hue, in the group. In other words, when I'm the only black person in the group, or there's very little of us in the group. And most of the times, to be honest with you, it's in environmental circles. It comes up more often than not. Well, what can we do to get them to be involved? And my answer is always the same: help them. If you want them to be involved in what you're doing, if you want people that look like me, if you want indigenous people, if you want brown people, if you want poor people to help you, help them. Not to go in to help them just so that they can help you, but simply help them because they need the help. The reality is, my brothers and my sisters, when we really look at things, you can plant pollution, but you can't contain it. And the same pollution that ails the people is the same pollution that ails the planet. If you could help the people, you can help the planet. I believe I'll say that again because I like to say that. If you can help the people, you can help the planet. In fact, if you can heal the people, you can heal the planet. Somebody just said in the chat, say it again, so I might as well, since you encouraged me. If you can help the people, if you can heal the people, you can help and you can heal the planet. The same pollution that ills the people, the same emissions that ill the people are the same things that ill the planet. The problem that we have is that we often overlook those who are in need of help. But today, I'm telling you that there are some people that are knocking. There are some communities that are knocking. The question is, will you inconvenience yourself enough to take action? Thank you. Listen, I'm going to give it back to Cody because I've gone too long without seeing his face, and I just got to see him again.
Well, thank you for doing that, Michael, and we'll bring Dr. Ayers back as well and have a little bit of conversation. I can listen to you talk about this all the time, and that's why I asked you to be here. And I love how you said, if you can heal the people, you can heal the planet, because one of your big risks, and I steal this from you all the time, is there can be no real action on climate unless there's action on environmental justice. That you can't have any sort of climate justice without addressing environmental justice issues. And if you could fix that, you could fix some of the issues on climate and environment. And so it is so tied to relationships. And Michael, both in your work and Dr. Ayers in your work, it is about relationships. It's about storytelling. It's about all that. And so I'll kind of open it up. I don't know, I'll give you, Dr. Ayers, the opportunity to respond to if there's anything that Michael said that you want to respond to, but also then kind of dig into this work about relationships and maybe some of the stories that you have.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that was really striking to me about what you were saying, Michael, was that very point about, and I want to add another layer to it, that when you're talking about the relative whiteness of the environmental movement and the desire to have it be a more diverse group, often it rests on an assimilationist assumption that why don't, they come join us. But in my research, my experience is that there are seeds of environmental movements everywhere in every community, and it might not be called that. It might not be called, one of the things that I was working with a research team, and when we were using a term that we called ecological faith that is grounded in ecological principles. And for us, that meant it's about relationships. It attends to human relationships and relationships with the planet. But for so many communities of color, they were like, I would never use that word. Yeah. But the work that they were doing was very attentive to relationships between humans, economic relationships, and environmental relationships. And so I think one of the challenges in the environmental justice, the environmental movement is to, frankly, we have to kind of search out the white supremacist thinking that is in the movement, in the environmental movement, and find all the environmental work that is and partnering with those communities rather than assuming that, this community needs an environmental organization to come in and help partner with the work that's already being done there, with the leaders that are already doing that work there. I think that that's a really key piece that I was thinking about while you were talking.
Yeah, I always tell people when I'm asked, what can we do to get involved? Help the people that are already doing it.
Yeah.
For me, that's just as simple as you can make it. More often than not, if we be honest with ourselves, we don't like to inconvenience ourselves. So it's easy for us to give money to some of the larger organizations and think that we've done our job. Mm-hmm. But those are often not the ones that are actually doing the work. The ones that are doing the work are in the communities that you don't want to go and get dirty in.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Or you drive by when you're getting ready to go home and you don't really look at it.
Yeah.
So a question on this note from Facebook, Michael, I'll ask you to respond first, but it's in the vein of kind of helping your neighbors and partnering with those on the ground who are doing the work. And the question is, what would you say to your neighbor that doesn't perceive that they need help? And in relation to the environmental crisis, how would you relate the environmental crisis to someone who doesn't realize that it's happening and that it is indeed a crisis that will affect them?
So for me, I don't generally talk about climate crisis. I don't. And it's not that I don't think that that's an issue.
Right.
I just know with the communities that I serve, the communities that I love and I appreciate and adore and all of the other sentiments that you can say about it, those communities don't have the time to discern the language of climate justice or the language of the climate crisis. But they are saying it. So I find ways to talk about what really is ailing them. Let's talk about the fact that your baby can't breathe and why your baby can't breathe. And that way we start talking about the emissions, and we can even talk about the fact or relate that to the planet and say the same thing that's ailing your baby is ailing the planet as well, and the planet can't breathe. So, I mean, there's ways to make connection where you meet them at the level of what Dr. Howard Thurman would call the level of the ashtray. You meet them where they are. And again, for me, and I meant to say this before, Black folk, indigenous folk, poor folk, especially indigenous folk, we really need to learn from indigenous folk. But they are talking. They're not just talking white folk language, or they just aren't talking white folk language. And that in itself is an injustice, and we really need to look at that. And I'm gonna say it real quick, and then I'll jump off of it to let y'all grab hope to it. But we really need to look at the fact that the language has been put in a place where only a certain group understands it, and a certain group can speak it fluently. And it was purposefully and intentionally done so that it can separate the resources from the communities that really need them. We really need to talk about the fact that environmental justice is just now starting to really get some traction when it's been talked about for 40 years. I mean, we got to talk about these things and talk about the injustice in the environmental movement and really hone into that.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add something to that? Yeah. For example, one of the things that is very frustrating to me is to read in ecological literature a distinction between what some would call shallow ecology and others would call deep ecology. And they call shallow ecology anything that kind of starts with human concerns, which to me is just, I mean, that's like, it totally dismisses the whole entry point for so many communities who enter the conversation because of public health crises, because of economic crises that are connected to ecological issues. And I think it also actually it's intellectually flawed to assume that having an entry point that is related to human concerns necessarily makes it shallow. Actually, I think it makes it multi-layered and intersectional. And that's how, I think, to me, to have sort of moral and intellectual integrity about it, you have to be always thinking about the human points of connection, because we're part of the ecology. It's not like we're separate.
Right.
As humans. Yeah.
I mean, to get about what both of you are saying, it is a way to isolate environmental concerns to just nature is incredibly privileged, because then you care about some things that do matter, but it is intentional so that you don't make the connections with everything else that is related to the environment. And so I think the intersectional conversation that we're having is incredibly important. And I'm reminded, I mean, we can draw this out in a couple of different ways, but Dr. Ayers, I'll push it to you because we've talked about this before, but an example of that is the crisis in which we live now that intersects with the pandemic that's going on now. You have written a lot on food systems and agriculture in the US and abroad, and it is no secret that pandemics are connected to the ways in which we treat our food systems and our forests and things like that, and that then impacts the people who grow our food and pick our food, and that those injustices just kind of roll down. And so I'll let you speak to that a little bit if you want, and then I'll push it to Michael.
I'll try not to go on a rant about this, but I mean, just from the very beginning, even in March and April, when people who are working particularly in the meatpacking industry, predominantly workers of color, were deemed essential employees. And there was a moment in which it looked like, I think this sort of got shut down. This idea got shut down, but it looked like there was a moment where meatpacking plants were going to be sort of forced to remain open during a period of time. And most of them have sort of chosen to do that. And everybody who has a job there wants to keep their job. And so there have been terrible outbreaks in some of these places where people are working in very close proximity. The ventilation is not good. And there are few to no protections to protect those workers. And of course, this is like building on a long history. I mean, a long history of exploitation of workers in the agricultural system. Everybody from farm workers to people who work in distribution to people who work in fast food and convenience stores. So all of these low-wage workers are subjected to incredible threats to their health. Some of the beginnings of the food justice movement can be traced back to Cesar Chavez and the Delano grape pickers strikes in the 1960s. Workers who were fed up and had had enough with the threats to their health that were posed by a food system that demands cheap food in large quantities, and the prevalence of cheap food makes possible a system in which low-wage jobs are still acceptable, because as long as you don't have to pay very much for food, you don't have to pay people very much to be able to buy food. And so we have a system in which food is artificially depressed in price, which allows us to keep wages depressed, and that money is going somewhere. Some people are getting.
Let me add to that, and then Michael, I'll push it to you, because it highlights something that we know, which is that our food systems, our energy systems, our systems of policing, all rely on the devaluing of particular communities of color, and rely on sacrifice zones. Pick what you want. If you want to talk about energy systems and you want to talk about wood pellets that are being burned, or places that are the forest is being cut down, or coal-fired power plants. Those things are situated in communities that they will poison intentionally. We can talk about exactly what you did on food systems. We see all over the place the results of a system that continues to devalue Black and brown bodies, both in policing, but also in these environmental concerns. If you pick a pipeline or you pick any of these environmental justice communities that's happening to. And so I'll just lift that up as I pass it over to you, Michael, to talk about some of those intersections. I know that's work that you've been working on just this week, new issues that are happening.
Yeah, so Dr. Robert Bullard has taught me that environmental justice is not just about the bad things that come into the community. It's also about keeping the good things out of the community. So I don't even like to say food desert. It's food apartheid, because you can't say it's a food desert when you can go 5 blocks up and you can get a gourmet meal. But 5 blocks away, you don't have any fresh food sources. And that's what happens to environmental justice communities. In Stonecrest, Georgia, I was contacted over the weekend from a community in Stonecrest, Georgia, that needed some assistance because the mayor and the city council had approved for a waste facility to go literally in the neighbors' backyards in a community. And these were $250,000, $270,000 homes. This is an all-Black community. And the mayor and the city council is all Black. They said it can't be environmental racism. I said, why not? Do you own the company that is trying to come in? Just because you are the one that approves it or disapproves it doesn't mean that you aren't the one that's approaching to be the one that's doing the approaching. And the entire thing is, and to answer Colin in the same frame, it's about education. What we did, we made a video, we put a video out, and we literally showed the public how the distance between these people's houses and this facility going up. Using our drone, we flew over to show them that there was just a thin line between the houses and this waste facility. But when you look on the other side, there's Marshall's warehouse, and there's a big buffer zone in between Marshall's warehouse and this waste facility. There is something absolutely fundamentally wrong with that entire picture. You rather protect the environmental stressors than the people that are being stressed out. There's something fundamentally wrong with that entire picture. And so when you look at the things that come in, these things are the things that bring down our housing value. So now you have a polluted housing, polluted land that you paid premium price for, that you're now underwater in because it's not worth the price that you paid for it. And in addition to, you have limited opportunities to get out of that situation. So you basically got a sinkhole now that's being polluted every day, and you have to live in this pollution. And some of the toxins, the common toxins, are the toxins that form cancer and asthma. Mm-hmm. So you not only, and in addition to, there's no guarantee that there's any tax dividends or tax dollars coming from this, because they subsidize everything. Excuse me. I just felt that, which robs from your community, and the only thing you get is pollution. Something is fundamentally wrong with that picture. Now, will a community that I speak with be more inclined to listen to that than me tell them to get the temperature down 1.5? I believe they absolutely will. And I believe if I wanted to rally about that, they'd come to my rescue. And if I stop that, I also stop emissions. If you help the people, you heal the planet.
Yeah, There's so much to say about that. I mean, we had, I know on the show, the Enviro Show last week, talking about coal ash, and you both know from our work in Juliet that they talked about last week that we create these systems in which not only the things, when we're producing the energy, that people breathe it, they are exposed to it on their skin, that kills them, but that then when we dispose of the waste, we dispose of it in ways where it continues to poison communities. So in addition to that poisoning, we also create systems, at least here in Georgia, where so communities are being poisoned by it in the water that they drink and the air that they breathe and the contact with their skin. And yet in Southwest Atlanta, we have the highest energy burden in the state. So the communities in which we sacrifice to produce the energy can't even afford the energy that they're giving their lives up to produce, that we're forcing them to give their lives up to produce. And so we create, I wanted to at least drop energy burden in there because that's a huge piece of environmental justice that often people miss, is that we have these structures of how we bill people and how we continue to put those burdens on. And I'll open up for you all to respond to that if you want to.
Well, let me talk about energy burdens, because that's my other thing that's close to my heart. Because energy burdens are tied to our economic system. In Alabama as well as Georgia, vulnerable communities or vulnerable households pay between 8 to 10% of their income goes to energy. If they were able to have energy efficiency and they were able to have access to owning their own energy through solar, they could save 30% of their income yearly. That would help them to get out of poverty. But that is intentional that they don't. That they keep them in poverty. Because the reality is the system by which we have, which is capitalism, needs free and cheap labor in order to thrive.
Right.
And those sacrifice zones are zones that people of color are in.
Michael or Cody, could you guys talk more about sacrifice zones? That might be a term that I'm thinking might be new to some of the people watching.
I'm happy to do that, give a little brief example. I will do it in terms of talking about the nuclear power plant, Plant Vogtle, because I think it's a tangible thing to talk about. Because if you want to talk about, a lot of people will talk about nuclear energy as clean energy because it produces no emissions, despite the amount of energy that it takes to produce the concrete for the facility and the amount of water that it uses for those facilities. Even still, the ways in which we get the materials to make the reactors for those things to function kill our neighbors in New Mexico and Arizona, primarily indigenous communities. So we pillage the resources and the health of someone somewhere else to benefit from it. That's essentially what a sacrifice zone means. So you harm a community intentionally by stripping resources from them and exposing them to environmental and public health impacts so that you might benefit from it without any of those impacts yourself at a different location.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'll actually, I mean, on top of that, we had another question asking about, this will probably be our last question, but asking about, both in terms of sacrifice zones, but also some things like happening in Stonecrest, also some of your work, Dr. Ayers, getting people to engage ecology in their local place, that when these issues come up, so there's an example that someone put in that there's a wood pellet facility down in Adel, Georgia, that they're seeking a permit for. Obviously, that's a huge problem and produces a lot of emissions and also contributes to climate change. But sometimes faith leaders in particular, or people of faith, are resistant to get involved in environmental justice issues. And I wonder if you would both talk about that a little bit, about why some of that resistance is and how we might continue to get faith leaders to come into this conversation, because obviously they're important and that's why we're here.
Well, surely I'm not the spokesman for the faith community. I can just tell you in my experiences of those who I've dealt with, as Cody alluded to earlier, it's really about forming relationships. if you think you can just step to them and you know, I'm gonna help you solve your problems, you're gonna get pushback. The fact of the matter is, we got egos, and a lot of times it's to our detriment. So you'll get pushback. But if you go in and you truly spend time and form those relationships, they'll be more inclined to listen. As well as in my experience in working with wood pellets so far, they beat us to the punch every time. They've already gone in and greased the wheel, put the word out, made themselves to be this, that, and the other. And so when we come in with an alternative reality, it throws people off. Some may take a step back and see that we have a valid point, but some automatically just resist. So again, it's really about forming those relationships to find out what's being said and how it's moved people.
Mm-hmm. I think the other challenge that I think you're alluding to, Michael, or at least I'm thinking about, is the tension that is set up between economic security and ecological consequences. And so a lot of jobs are promised with these industries coming into a community, jobs that actually mysteriously do not materialize once the work is happening on the ground. I'm thinking about, in particular, some of the fracking up in West Virginia and Pennsylvania that actually had people coming from other places. There were not local jobs that were produced out of that. And so one thing that I wonder about is partnering with religious communities to think about local job creation and how can faith communities participate in alternative economic possibilities for a community, and supporting local business, supporting local agriculture, other things like that. I think are a piece of what's needed, because in some, especially in rural areas, I mean, people really are struggling, and it's going to get worse after this year. So many industries closing down, so that's an uphill climb, and I'm not surprised, Michael, to hear that. Are you saying that people have already come to faith leaders and sort of greased the wheel, like people from the industry, to sort of get them on their side?
Oh yeah. They send their representatives in, and by guesstimate, they sent them in a year early.
Before it was even an idea that the community even knew about, probably.
Right. I mean, they start working on them, hosting various events at the church, community dinners and stuff like that, or community barbecues.
Yeah.
All this stuff just to put the best face forward.
Right.
And before you know it, boom.
Yeah.
You suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for coming on, Dr. Ayers and Michael, for the work that you both do and lifting up sort of these intersections of ecology and place and environmental justice and action. And I think that is so key to make sure that communities understand those intersections, to provide opportunities for people to get engaged in that work, and then to lift up the work of community voices. And Michael, I'll of course reiterate something that you said, which is, you know, if you heal people, if you partner with people, then you can really do something about the planet. And I know that this whole series is about Stand for Forests. It's a part of the Dogwood Alliance's work. And I would venture to say, I will take a point of privilege to say that if you stand with people, you can stand with forests, and vice versa, that we can't separate God's creation from people. So thank you both for being on here. And I will give our viewers a couple of action items based off of this conversation. So some action items. If you're at home and you're listening and you're thinking, I've heard all this stuff, I'm inspired, what do I do? So I'm going to give you 2 action items. If you're looking for ways to get involved with fighting for more just energy policies here in Georgia, we're talking about energy burden, some of the things that Michael and I were talking about, that in Southwest Atlanta, those communities pay more of their after-tax income on energy than anywhere else in the state. Please visit Fair Energy Now and sign up for updates. You can see that on the screen. It's fairenergynow.org. Sign up for our updates and you'll get updates on what policies are coming down that you can be involved in and help advocate for fair energy policies and the pursuit of clean energy. Our next action item is if you want some additional tools to equip yourself and if you're a member of a congregation or faith community in terms of climate resilience, then please join us tomorrow night for the first ever Southeast Faith Leaders Network Climate Resilience Summit. This event is free. You can sign up on the link on your screen. You can also go to gipl.org and look at our events page, and you can find it there. We'll be talking about the ways in which climate change intersects with how our communities can be more resilient and some of the environmental justice issues that need to be addressed in terms of disaster preparedness. If you want to get in touch with me or someone from our team, or get involved with any of GIPL's programs that I alluded to earlier, or get in contact with these speakers, please feel free to visit us at giplgipl.org. So thank you all for joining us here tonight for this special 6 weeks of information on environmental and justice issues across the state. We hope that you've enjoyed this program put forward by the Dogwood Alliance and our partners. If you missed an episode, they are available on Facebook. The beauty of the internet. They're recorded there for you, and the full series will be on Dogwood Alliance's YouTube channel as well. So please schedule some classes, get together with your friends, watch these videos, and figure out ways to get involved with your community. Thank you to the Dogwood Alliance for producing the show and all the partners who were lifted up in the work that they are doing through this show. Thank you all for listening and participating with us, for asking questions and being involved and interested in environmental and climate justice issues here in Georgia. Thank you also to the volunteers who worked very, very hard to pull this show off. Be sure to let us know if you want to see the return of another season of the Georgia Enviro Show. But for now, thank you so much and good night.